So now that we've got the dataset tool library installed, let's run some really simple commands just to sort of take a look at what we have here. So the first thing that we want to do is just take a look at this documentation here and just sort of get a sense of how things work. At the top here, you'll see something that says basic usage. So we do want to run a Python command. We want to run the datasets-tools script, and then we want, there's a couple different arguments we can put in here. So it looks like the most basic thing we can do is we just need to provide an input folder and an output folder. Now the next thing we need to think about is like, what do we actually want to do? So I'll let you know that like the thing you want to look at to begin with is just the process type. The default for this is resize. So basically it's going to take all of your images and it's going to resize them to whatever the max size is. It defaults to 512. So why don't we actually look at this and just start building this and just sort of see what a default script is going to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my terminal and I'm going to start typing Python dataset-tools. One thing to remember is that you need to be inside the dataset-tools folder. If you're not, this won't work. So make sure you're in your dataset-tools folder. The next thing we need to do is apply an input folder. I'm actually just going to come over here real quick and just grab one of my files. I have like a bunch of bulk data sets that I use pretty frequently. I'm just going to come in here and grab one of them. Let's just grab this folder. It happens to be a folder of my flowers that I usually use in my work. They're very large. They probably won't open. But if I hit Command I, you'll see that these are pretty big. These are really large. This will like basically be way too large for what I want to do with machine learning. So let's just resize them. So what you can do is, I recommend you point this at a folder. Don't point it at individual images. That's going to be sort of time consuming. So you can point it at a folder. You can also point it at like a larger folder. You can point it at this master folder. It looks for all the files inside of any folder, including deeper layers inside of subfolders. But just for time's sake, I'm going to grab this folder. And I just, all I did here is I clicked on this folder and I hit Command C. And then you can come back over here and you hit Command V, and that pastes the entire path. So this is actually not, this is on a storage drive. This works. It's probably a little bit slower, but it does work. The next thing you need to do at this point is hit -- output folder. And I want to give this a location. For my work, usually what I do is I put this in the same folder that I'm in. So I put it in dataset tools. I'll usually just name the folder output just for cleanliness sake. And then let me just think about what I should rename this. Let's call it ladies crop, which is the type of images it is. And let's say resize, which is the default function here. And I know it's going to be 512. Basically, this is stuff I know. But basically, if I just use this as the baseline command and I hit return, you'll see it's going to start processing. So if I go back to my Finder window and I go to my home folder and then I go to dataset tools and I go to output, you'll see this is the folder I've been producing. There's another folder inside of here, and inside this folder now it has been producing 512 images. So this is just resizing, right? So this is just one way, this is a really simple default way to resize images. And this will run on a batch on every image inside that folder, and when it's done it will stop running. So that's resize. Let's actually look at some of the other functions here. So there's something called square, there's something called crop to square, there's something called canny. There's a number of different features here. Let's look at square. So why don't we just use square for the moment, and let's just sort of see what happens with that function. So if I hit up, I will get the exact same command back, and I'm just going to do square. I'm going to leave it at 512 for the moment, and let's just type in process type, and let's type in square. So if we run this function, let's see what happens. So now I've got a folder here called square. Inside here is a square 512. The reason I auto-generate a new folder for this is that if you want to use that same base folder but have different options in it, you can do that. So inside here I've got square. And what you'll see is different this time is that now the edge pixels have bled out, right? So it like basically takes it and it stretches it. That's one technique to make an image square. It's pretty helpful. One thing that should note if you're going to use this in something like StyleGAN is it will learn these weird stretchy things. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to generate a square, generate the StyleGAN images, and you'll probably have to bring them into another like function in Photoshop or something. You have to crop out that size. But this is a technique that does work. It obviously, like, what it doesn't do is it doesn't crop any of your details. So it allows you to keep the image as is, and it just sort of like blends the sides. So that is Square with 512. One thing that we can look at in Square is we can maybe change that behavior. So if we look at border type here, you'll see that the border style used during the Square process. So there's a couple options here. There's stretch, there's reflect, and there's solid. So the default's to stretch, which is what we saw, which is it takes those edge pixels and it just stretches them. So let's take a look at what reflect does. So I'm going to type in, what is the command? It is border type. And let's do reflect. I don't think I need anything else there. So just for my own sanity, I'm going to add Square reflect, just so I've got this clean. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to come back to Finder. And inside of here, I've got Square reflect. If you look at this, you'll see now the edges reflect. This is, again, another technique you could use. What this will give you, depending on your image, is it'll give you almost a little bit of a tiling function. So in some cases, you'll see that the flower sort of reflects the edges. For something like Square like this, I might just leave it as is. It's sort of up to you to determine whether you want to stretch or do other things. With StyleGAN, it generally will train regardless. But just like, do you want it to learn that it needs to reflect images or not? The other function that you can do here is you can use solid. Now the note here is that you need to use a border color with this. So you have to pass in border color. So we're going to do that now. And then the command is that you need to pass it in a value here. One thing that's really important to note is this is BGR. So if you're used to working in RGB, it's actually reversed. So if you 25500, that's usually red in most applications, but in this application, that's blue. In this case, I'm going to actually maybe just, maybe one thing I want to do is I want to open one of these images. And actually, let me just pick a value here. So let's just pick this color, and let's see. So it's 184 and 222 and 235. So what this is going to do is this is actually going to mat it on like a solid color background, and we'll have a little bit of a different look, and we can sort of see what happens. So this actually gives you a completely solid color. Again, it's just a different look. StyleGAN will learn these edges, and you'll notice that like on this side it's too light, on this side it's too dark. All of these functions are meant to work quickly, but they're not the best, and it's going to be up to you to sort of decide what you want to do in terms of these functions. Okay, so that's sort of the basics of this. That is, we've done now resize square, and let's do crop to square. And then we'll sort of like call it a day for this video. So let's look at crop to square. This one, as the name might imply, actually just crops the image down. So rather than extending the edges, it actually just crops in. Let's take a look at that. So I'm going to remove these functions, and I want to change the process type to crop to square. So I'm just going to rename this square crop. So again, this is still using max size. This is still only going to be 512, but let's see how different this is. Here's square crop. You'll see now it's cropping in on the image. And what's worth noting is that in this case, this image looks pretty good, but in this one, it's actually cropping to the top and bottom. And this is just something you're going to have to play with and figure out what you want to do in terms of the final output. But it's worth noting that sometimes crop to square doesn't work as well as you would hope it does. But it is a really quick function to just get the full image you have cropped down to a square, so you could pretty easily throw it into StyleGAN. Okay, so one last thing let's look at while I'm working here is there's a max size function. And this max size function for most of these tools allows you to set that max size, right? So 512 is pretty good. It's small. This is like a medium-sized StyleGAN. But if you're working in my class and you want to transfer learn off of the default StyleGAN network, you want this to be 1024. So let's look at how to change this. So I'm going to hit up, and I'm going to type in --max_size. And this time I'm going to do 1024. So defaults to 512 at all times. But if you change this number pixel-wise, it's just going to change the size that it scales down to before doing the crop. So it's important to note that I'm always looking at almost the same input folder here. This is a super high-res image. It's 3180, and I'm resizing it and then cropping it. So with most of the functions in this tool set, it resizes first and then crops to whatever size we need. So in the case of a thing where it wasn't cropped to square, but it was just that crop where it was just square and it stretched the edges, it's going to resize and then stretch the edges. So it's important to remember sort of the order of operations that are happening here. So let's look at this with 1024. I, of course, did not name this correctly, so we'll see what happens with this. So you'll see actually inside of this square crop folder, there is a square 512 and a square 1024. And I do that just to sort of manage these, and also, like, in this exact case, I will forget to rename something, and I want to make sure I don't overwrite files. And so now we've got the exact same crops, but if we look at the size of this, you'll see it's 1024 by 1024. So this covers most of the basic examples of using the dataset tool library to scale things. So in the next video, I'll probably do a little bit, I'll look at some new functions. So there's some cropping functions, and there's some ways in which we could differentiate or alter our crops, and I'll look at some examples of that. They'll be a little bit more advanced, but this is the basic stuff. If you have questions about any of these other things that are here in the dataset tool library, feel free to drop a note in the YouTube channel or in my Slack channel, and I'll get back to you. Thanks.